I think I'll give it a few minutes before I start. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm going to give it a few more minutes for people to join. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Perfect. I still see people joining, so I'm going to. It's a hot topic. All right, well, let's get started so we don't keep everybody waiting too long. This is the third seminar in our Regulatory Ethics Knowledge and Support 2021 Summer Series on clinical trials. Today, we're going to have a webinar on EConsent presented by Marianne Hinkson from MHRI, or MedStar Health Research Institute. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. If you want to submit questions for the speaker to address, please do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And you can also do them anonymously if you don't want us to know who you are. That's fine. Also, use the chat function if you're having trouble with your video or audio or any technical support you may require. Okay. Next screen. It gives me great pleasure in introducing Marianne. I've known her for quite some time while I was at MedStar. She is the current Vice President for Research Operations and is responsible for providing direction and day-to-day management and oversight of the research operations occurring at MedStar Health Research Institute. MHRI is actually the research arm for the MedStar health system. She ensures ongoing training and education of research staff and fosters relationships with sponsors and physicians conducting clinical trials. Please welcome Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla. Okay. All right, can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and welcome everyone. I hope you're enjoying the Regulatory Ethics and Knowledge series this summer, and I also hope you're enjoying your summer as well. Again, Marianne Hinkson, the Vice President of Research Operations at MedStar Health. And as the summer series is focused on decentralized clinical trials, today's focus is specific to EConsent, where EConsent is executed through a mobile platform, and it does completely replaces the traditional paper-based informed consent. So the agenda today, I will give you an overview regarding the EConsent, specifically why EConsent, what is it? Where is EConsent globally, just to give you a sense of what's going on across the world. The different media components of EConsent, implementing an EConsent platform, that's a really big topic, and the tools and resources needed to implement and maintain a platform and emerging trends. And following this, I'm going to briefly walk you through the MedStar Health Research implementation and EConsent process and show you actually what an EConsent looks like. So first, and most importantly, the consent process, regardless of paper or electronic, is rooted in the Declaration of Helsinki and the International Council on Harmonization Good Clinical Practices. And as we know, the consent process is the cornerstone of clinical research today. History has taught both investigators and research participants many valuable lessons, and informed consent is more than just a document, it's an entire process. So as we go through this, you're going to hear me bring up a couple times the process of the informed consent. So sites can reduce the administrative and time burdens inherent to the traditional paper consent. Integrating EConsent should reduce time-consuming paper processes. So when you think about a paper consent, we need to download it, we need to print it, we review it to make sure we downloaded the correct version. It's signed, we need to scan it, then we file it. And if there's a reconsent, we have to do the same process. And these are repetitive tasks that take a lot of time for a site's trial team. So less time, when you think about it, with the burdensome administrative tasks means more time with research participants enrolling and actually practicing medicine. So EConsent, when fully integrated, can give sites effective tools to properly, efficiently, and openly communicate trial details during the entire informed consent process. So patients will understand what they are agreeing to in ways that make sense to them. And what I mean by that is with EConsent, you can also have images, you can have diagrams, you can have video, you can have audio for the hearing impaired, and it will move the process of informed consent away from focusing on consenting and really toward the goal of truly informing a clinical research participant, because now we have so many ways to do that. So when we look across the globe, and really this is just to give you a sense of what's going on globally. So Transcelerate, it's a company, a nonprofit that focuses on addressing inefficiencies and advancing innovation in research and development. And they conducted a landscape assessment actually in 2016, 2018, and 2019. And they just wanted to see what was really going on with EConsent and submissions. And the intention was to share the collected data. It was a blinded survey, and to share it with biopharmaceutical companies, clinical research organizations, and EConsent vendors. And even though the last survey was in 2019, as you can see, that there is about 40 countries that have submitted an EConsent submission to either health authorities, an institutional review board, or an independent ethics committee. But out of those 40 countries, 31 countries actively consented patients using. So not all countries that have submitted have actually used the consent. So for FDA research, the electronic consent must be considered equivalent to full handwritten signatures. And the electronic signatures must comply with all applicable requirements under 21 CFR Part 11. And this is specific to electronic signatures. And research under Health and Human Services regulations also require an authenticated signature. All research must meet the equivalent protections of Health and Human Services and FDA, in which case an authenticated signature would be required unless a waiver of consent documentation was granted by the IRB. I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail when I talk about MedStar's health journey, and really getting a little bit more into the 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. And as I mentioned earlier, as we look at the different media components, EConsent platforms, again, can incorporate videos, audio for the hearing impaired, visual aids. Actually, there's a glossary. If a patient is reading through the informed consent and there's a word they don't understand, they can hover over. A glossary will come up and explain. And a lot of other features that could occur with an EConsent platform. So planning and executing an EConsent platform is critical, just like you would do with any other software application. So first you need to define or plan for the implementation. And planning includes the scope. What is your scope of work? The resources. Do you have the correct people at the table? So in other words, information services, compliance, privacy officer, the research coordinators. And of course, the budget, the time frame to implement this, the roles and responsibilities, and of course, requirements and responsibilities for the application. Second, you create or develop the workflow and the processes. So this is what you want your workflow to look like once you implement. And some questions you may want to ask are, what consents are reasonable for EConsent process? Maybe there's some scenarios where it doesn't really apply. What about translated consents? Can we do that? How will you conduct user acceptance testing, validation, training, and then the final release? Third is the deployment and monitoring. So this includes user access, full implementation, monitoring the process, and then during this whole entire process, have you found any gaps? And let's fix those gaps. And last really is to empower. So what you want to do, and it's not specific to EConsent, but any software application that you are implementing, is capture those lessons learned, both the positive and the negative, as we learn from project failures and project successes. So make this an ongoing effort through the life of the product, and using lessons learned will identify any process improvements. By not learning from project failures, we are doomed to repeat similar situations. By not maximizing also on the project successes, we miss opportunities to implement good processes and practices to successfully complete existing and future work. So next I want to talk about the tools and resources needed. And again,
Marianne, could I
yes,
cut in here for a second?
sure.
Some of the participants are having a hard time seeing your screen because you've got two sets of slides up there. I'm wondering if you can go from from slideshow to presenter view. I'm not quite sure how to do that. Maybe Ranger can.
Yes.
Go to the go to the three dots on the right and click it.
The three dots in the circle.
Yeah, 3 dots in a circle.
Ah, got it.
And then go hide presenter view.
Oh,
is that better?
Awesome. Oh, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well,
I'm
thank you for that.
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. Okay. So let's talk about the tools and resources needed to implement an EConsent. And even though I'm talking about EConsent, this really can apply to anything. And we did this with our CTMS, our clinical trial management system, with our Huron IRB system. And it's the same model that we followed for the EConsent software application. So first, project infrastructure. So you really want to invest in a solid IT infrastructure upfront. And that includes the development, testing, and user acceptance testing. And user acceptance testing is very critical in anything that you implement. Requirement changes, you must ensure that the product outcomes align with the expectations and requirements. So maybe an example of that is you say, we're going to implement EConsent, it's completely paperless. Well, what if you implement it, but actually it wasn't 21 CFR compliant? So that means that does not align with your expectations. Quality assurance, developers must follow a formal quality assurance process. In other words, don't cut any corners. Just follow the quality assurance and complete the project. Undefined standards, really what this means is ensure that there are several cycles of testing, just test and test and test to make sure that, again, going back to the requirement changes, that the product outcome align with the expectations. The latest market trends, hands-on resources. It's good that you have somebody that has experience, whether it's with the IS, the product, because if you have somebody that's not experienced, it will impact the timeline. And it may draw out your timeline a little bit more because as they're implementing, they're learning as well. Design influence. There's an influence that may come from stakeholders. And maybe what may occur is you developed your workflow, your processes, and they may come back and say, you know what, I would like the system to do this and not to do that. If you make those changes, make sure that you get buy-in from all stakeholders and ensure consistent experience across the device, the other factors, and the stakeholders. The application integration. This is a tricky one. So this is really integrating different technologies. And when you start integrating different technologies, of course, this adds complexity and delays. But it's a normal thing that happens. And an example I can give again is a clinical trial management system. So maybe you would like it to integrate directly with your EMR. So it's possible, it's done all the time, but again, it's an added complex, makes it a little bit more complex. Project management, make sure that you have a project manager to focus on the implementation and make sure that they don't have too many different implementation or tasks going on, because really you want the implementation to be seamless. You don't want your timelines to be extended. Test environment, I can't stress how much it's so important to have a test environment. And typically what happens is you test it in a controlled environment, which is really not a real environment. It's just, is the system, how we build it, again, is what we said it's going to do, is it doing that? Once you once you built it and tested it, and yes, it aligns with our expectations, then you actually take the application and test it in a real environment. And typically that's where what we call the pilot study. And last, security infrastructure. As you know, every day we look in the news, there's security breaches all over, they're on the rise. And you need to make sure that each layer of the application is secure. So, emerging trends. The concept of decentralized clinical trials, really, it's not new. But in response to COVID and the disruptions of COVID, research operation leaders were forced really to accelerate plans for remote and virtual trials. So decentralization really doesn't mean siteless. It means localization. And what I mean by that is you're allowing more local and community-based health clinics and provider offices to participate in research. In other words, we come to them. So we can conduct clinical trials maybe at a local pharmacy or maybe at a neighborhood doctor's office. One of the things we have done is actually worked and collaborated with our home healthcare nurses and have done some visits. So the idea really is to spread research to patients who do not traditionally have the opportunity to participate in studies. And again, we are bringing the research to them. So at this point now, I just want to walk through and briefly describe our journey at MedStar Health Research Institute when we implemented our EConsent platform. So the first thing you want to do is you want to look at vendors. With this slide, MedStar Health Research Institute, we chose the vendor Interlace Health, and they were formerly called FormFast. And the purpose of the slide is to let you know that MedStar Health has had a long history with Interlace Health. As you can see, MedStar Southern Maryland had partnered with Interlace for almost 23 years in the clinical area, and their forms are built, stored, and used electronically, and electronic signatures are in place. And also in MedStar Montgomery, they have been using the forms management. So although we, MedStar Health Research Institute, completed several demos with many different EConsent vendors, we really believed Interlace had the best product. It was just a bonus that had continued success with Interlace, and we were very already with our electronic health record. So for us, I have to say everything fell in place very nicely. So after we chose the vendor, what we thought we would do is we really needed the IRB input. But at the same time, this is fairly new. So when we presented to the IRB, we also educated them as well on the EConsent platform. And this was prior to our implementation. So first, and most important, our message to the IRB was really more people are using electronic devices to read and retain information. And electronic devices provide the same information as print or paper. An example I like to use is, let's just say I pick up the Wall Street Journal online and I'm reading it on my iPad. I'm getting the exact same information as if I pick up the Wall Street Journal that was delivered to my home. It looks exactly the same. And in a way, it's a logical step to do the same thing for obtaining consent. And sponsors are starting to ask if we had this capability. And actually during COVID, we got this question quite often: do you have e-consent capabilities? We presented to the IRB that we wanted to be able to offer the option of both e-consent and paper. And especially during crisis like COVID, e-consent adds really an additional safety to both parties and associates by supporting physical distancing. The most important message to the IRB was that e-consent is not meant to replace the important discussion, the process between the patient and the site staff. That will always be there. And what we did is when we spoke to the IRB, currently MedStar in Georgetown, we have policies and procedures that we wrote and implemented together. And we have our consent policies and procedures. Again, it's a consistent method for obtaining and documenting the informed consent process, whether it's paper or electronic. So the diagram you see here was taken directly from our informed consent procedure. And the informed consent process begins when an investigator has identified a potential subject, and the process is ongoing until study participation ends. As you can see from the diagram, which is again part of our research operation procedures, the process includes the introduction. You conduct the consent process, you accommodate the potential research subject if they have any disabilities. One of the big things is really differentiating that between clinical care and research. And make sure that the potential research subject understands that they can refuse to participate and it will not in any way impact their clinical care. The next step is the explanation. We use simple language and non-technical terms. We all know that informed consent sometimes are not written at a certain level. So we really need to try to use simple language to inform the patient. And consider the potential subject's reading level and primary language spoken. Do we need a translated informed consent? And again, investigator or delegated staff must explain all required elements. And then the comprehension, there's different ways to make sure that the potential subject does understand and comprehend. You can ask them questions, you can use the teach back method. The next stage is questions and answers. You can ask open-ended questions. You ask the potential research participant, do you have any questions for us? And just make sure that you provide ample opportunity for the exchange of information. And then of course, finally, the consent, where you give them time to read, to digest, and then you obtain the signatures. So the responsibilities set forth in the regulations related to the IRB and research staff do not change for e-consent. And that was really our message to the IRB. So after presenting to the IRB and receiving feedback, we completed our build and testing phase of e-consent and moved into the pilot phase. And as you can see from the diagram, the intent was a gradual rollout strategy. By using a phased deployment strategy, it gave us the opportunity to control the level of complexity and manage training and user adoption. We just didn't want to do a big bang, put it out there. We wanted it to be successful. And our goal was to offer the option of either e-consent or paper consent to potential subjects. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So onboarding and training was first. Once the application was built, installed, and tested, we developed training to ensure our research coordinators were able to use and understand all functions and features. And then we did our pilot study. So prior to the full release, like I just stated, the software was pre-tested with a small test group, and then we moved the application and we invited research participants to help us in the pilot phase. And the last thing was the monitoring, maintenance, and follow-up throughout the pilot phase. We monitored user feedback, both research coordinators and the research participants, and we got some very, very valuable feedback. So this is a very high-level overview of our EConsent process. It is truly paperless from beginning to end. And potential subjects are approached for study participation just as if we would approach them using traditional paper-based. There's no difference. And if interested, we offer them either e-consent or paper consent. And the steps for e-consent, if you look at number 1, if the patient is not in the MedStar Health registration system, we go ahead and register them. And then the potential subject is also added to what we call the Interlace Connect or the EConsent platform. Once that's done, the research team activates the subject and assigns the proper consent. The research team will discuss the electronic process with the potential subject and discuss what to expect next. So in other words, they're going to let them know the steps that they need to follow. In number 2, an email is sent to the subject, and 2-factor authentication is required to access the e-consent. Again, the research coordinator is there and supporting the patient the entire time. Number 3, now the consent process takes place. And this goes back to the earlier slide where we do the introduction, the explanation, assessing comprehension, allowing time for questions and answers, and then obtaining consent. This can be done in person or in the physical absence of the research team in times of crisis such as COVID. And as you can see in the diagram, the consent can be reviewed on a personal computer, a smartphone, a smart tablet. We actually have done e-consent when the patient's actually right at the site with an iPad, so you can be side by side. So just think of it as really, it's a really nice technology. Fourth, the subject and research staff sign a consent. And then here's the nice part. The signed consent is automatically routed to MedConnect, our electronic health record, and a copy then goes to the subject. And the signed informed consent form is uploaded, again, automatically to MedConnect as required by the Joint Commission. So here, this is just in our test environment, but here's an example of what the login page looks like. And from our test, again, I'm sorry, I said it is from our test environment. And this requires a 2-factor authentication, which you don't see here. But the patient will go in and here's the example of their email address, and they'll get a password, and then a 2-factor authentication is sent to them. And 2-factor authentication, which you probably may be familiar with, it's really just an extra layer of security. And it's designed to ensure that you're the only person who can access this account. So even if someone does know your password, they don't have that 2-factor authentication. Here's an example, an actual snippet of our e-consent. And this actually mimics our paper consent. So what happens is the paper consent is approved by the IRB. that consent is built into the system, and it's built as an exact image of the paper consent. And then the IRB will review that again. And again, our EConsent solution is fully compatible with any device, iPhone, iPad, Android, and with any browser, Safari, Chrome, Edge, Internet Explorer. So this can be used pretty much with any type of device. And here's an example of the signature page. Again, our EConsent platform is 21 CFR compliant. I do just want to take a little bit sidestep here and just quickly talk about EConsent in Redcap. And I'm speaking specifically about MedStar Health. I'm not familiar with other entities, so I just want to make that clear that this is MedStar Health. And for those who are not familiar with Redcap, it's an acronym for Research Electronic Data Capture. And Redcap was created in, I believe, around 2004 at Vanderbilt University. And it originally supported a small group of researchers who needed a secure data collection tool, and it met HIPAA compliance standards. MedStar Health's Redcap is not 21 CFR compliant, meaning we can't get electronic signatures. We looked into it. It's very resource intensive, very labor intensive to validate, to maintain compliance. So at this time, we do not use Redcap for informed consent. But the little caveat, there have been very few instances where we have used Redcap. Only when the research meets the criteria for a waiver of documentation of informed consent. So what I mean by that, there may be a document that the patient may read online, and where participants are directed maybe to begin a survey after reading an information sheet. But just wanted to clarify that that's why we do not use Redcap if informed consent is required, because it is not 21 CFR 11 compliant. So barriers to e-consent, I will say technology. And here's why. I think all of us know technology is so complex. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with browsers. So there's Apple Safari, there's Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and it's just a software application for accessing the web. Well, after we implemented our EConsent platform, it was functioning beautifully, very well for several months. Safari's web browser, developed by Apple, had a version release blocking third-party cookies, which prevented cross-site tracking. So this version release by Apple significantly impacted many businesses across the United States, including InterHealth Lice. So Apple notified vendors of coming changes and released the version sooner than the industry anticipated, and the scope and depth of those changes were not clear. But basically, there was a complete lockdown of all cookies. Now, I'm not an IS expert. I can't go into a lot of depth about this, but what I can tell you, it basically crippled our EConsent platform for anyone that was using Apple products. Just to let you know, Google and other browser vendors are waiting to, my understanding is 2022 to implement these updates as well. So more to come on that. But anyway, so although Apple devices were impacted, we still could use our platform if our participants had other browsers like Chrome or Edge. So what we had to do basically is rebuild and validate our EConsent platform again. It took several months. And again, during that time, we really only offered our EConsent platform to those patients using non-Apple products. I think I just want to go back to where I stated about Redcap and the labor intensive and the burden. And I think this is probably a good example of why it's so, because this platform is hosted by Interlace Health. Obviously, we had to work hand in hand with them on both sides. But again, any type of platform and any type of technology, it's very complex and just a lot of work when it comes to IS. So the adoption of EConsent. So I have to tell you, it's mixed, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. So first, you have those that simply are just technology averse. I'm not a big fan of digital technology. I'm concerned about any harmful impacts. Is my system going to get, a bug or a virus? Or maybe they're just not tech savvy. Second, you have those individuals that are just really hesitant because of security concerns. Is anybody who's going to see my protected health information? And then you have those patients that, oh my gosh, I'll never go back to paper. So right now it's really a mix of patients that, when we offer them EConsent. So in summary, I'm going to take you back to the first slide, the framework of implementing EConsent. And while the shift to digital technology is prevalent across multiple industries, the informed consent process for clinical trials really has historically been paper-based. And as you heard from me today, implementation of new tools, software can be very complex. And prior to implementation, as I stated, the software really should be selected by assessing the needs, the budget, potential benefits, and any potential obstacles. So for the implementation and for the initiatives to succeed, again, it's important to follow the key steps of onboarding and training, a pilot program really thoroughly tested in the real environment, and then monitoring, maintenance, and the follow-up of the implementation. I have to say that during COVID, there were many, many benefits of EConsent during COVID, allowing for enhanced infection prevention and control. And EConsent took place over video chat or telephone. It decreased research staff viral exposure and decreased research-related use of personal protective equipment. In addition, the research participants can use their own devices. We don't need to hand them a MedStar iPad. They can use their own devices. And the clinical trial and the research team, really was thankful that we were able to get this up and running during the pandemic. So that was my conclusion, going over EConsent and then the MedStar Health Research Institute journey, and just happy to take any questions that you may have.
We do have a couple of questions that have come in. One is, how will we be able to overcome enrollment bias with EConsent if participants need to use mobile apps, especially the elderly and the underserved? Have there been studies regarding patient demographics and types of trials that are utilizing EConsent? And should we as the IRB or IRBs should always make sure that paper consenting or on-tablet consenting is available for all participants? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I can tell you from our experience, I'll be honest, and I can say this because I think of my parents who were in their 80s. When the one slide I talked about the technology averse, this was all over the place because there were elderly patients who absolutely loved EConsent and wanted EConsent. And we had younger patients that did not want to use it at all. So very different there. For every patient, we offer paper or EConsent. Paper is always, always available. Again, this is new. I think, there's going to be a while before it's really adopted. and just always making sure that it's available. The other thing at the site, and when we had this, we actually MedStar has some iPads, and I think in one of the slides I talked earlier that they're available at the sites. So, if people would like to try the EConsent, again, there's iPads there that they can use. They don't have to use their personal device. But I think the nice thing, again, with the personal device, and especially during COVID, is that you can do this process remotely. I don't know if I answered the questions or not.
Yeah. Also, have there been any issues with the length of the consent when using the consents? I know oncology studies are notoriously lengthy with their consent.
So, yep. So I'm back to here. Can you see the pointer at all here? I don't know if you can see that. It's okay. So this is an actual consent. And like I said, it mimics a paper consent. And down at the bottom, you can see these actually are the different pages. So you can see that the patient right now is on, and again, this is in our test environment, but they're on this page. What they can do is they can actually get out. Let's just say they just need a break or they have to do something. When they come back in, they know exactly where they were. The consent, again, Priscilla, does not change. If it's a 33-page consent in paper, I don't know what that translates into this, but it's the exact same text and length of consent. That does not change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's just that some of those consents can be daunting if you're reading them on an iPad, and it just goes on and on.
Yeah. What we found, most actually do the consent process on either their PC or iPad. Very rarely do they do it on their phone. But if they did it on their phone, it would look exactly like this, obviously much smaller, a much smaller screen, but this exact same image would come up.
Yeah, I do have trouble reading those forms when they come through on my smartphone, but I guess some people can do it. We have another question about the cost. And this is really relevant for those individuals or smaller systems who don't have a lot of money. What kind of cost comes with the different e-consent platforms like Interface Health, and would they be prohibitive for smaller healthcare systems?
So that's a very good question. So there is a cost. I can speak for MedStar Health. Everything that we implement has to go what's called through, I think it's called demand management. But basically, one of the slides I stated, I think it was this one, where we talked about security. So everything needs to go through security, our IS security. Is this going to be safe when we implement it? So there's cost to, let me give you an example. Let's say Redcap, and you want to make it 21 CFR compliant. Vanderbilt University does not do that. That is the burden of the site. We don't want to do that. For our EConsent platform, there was, because we worked hand in hand with them, there was cost to it. Obviously, the IS resource cost to get this up and running. And then there is a charge for licensing. But we were comfortable with that because we know this platform is safe and went through demand management. I can tell you since COVID, there are companies out there that are offering, it's called eReg Lite. And some of them do offer EConsent. We haven't really looked into those platforms, but I do know there's some companies out there that sort of took advantage of COVID and were offering some things, at a discounted or free price. For the most part, there is going to be a charge for it because, again, with the security, the validation, the verification, and the electronic signature. And I think that's where you need to look at different vendors, the cost of it, your budget, There's lots of e-consent vendors out there.
Oh, thank you. Do some of the, I know a lot of the sponsors are asking us if we can use e-consent. And if they're asking that, I'm wondering, I haven't asked them, but do they provide funding for us to use an e-consent?
Yeah, so what we do, that's a very good question. What we do in our clinical trial budget, we have what's called a technology fee. And we go to the sponsors and say, here's the technology fee, and it's for the maintenance of our clinical trial management system, our Huron IRB system, and now we can say our EConsent process. So that's where we build in the cost in our budget.
That's a great idea. I like that. And are they willing to pay it?
Absolutely. The other thing we do, I'll give you a little secret. And this is more for billing compliance, but for every visit, we add a very minimal charge for billing compliance, because for every single visit, there's things that we have to do to make sure that charges don't inadvertently get dropped, you know, to the wrong insurance. And we do get paid for those as well.
Oh, that's great.
But as long as you have an explanation as to why, and that it's compliance, sponsors have been very, very generous.
That's very good information. Another question just popped up. When do you think, or will sponsor monitors stop requiring paper binders altogether so that we can have electronic regulatory binders?
So that's an excellent question. If it was up to sponsors, I believe they would want them right now. The issue, and I know this is getting off e-consent a little bit, but we actually, again, MedStar Georgetown, because we work closely together, we have a process for remote monitoring. And that's where the sponsor can come in and get directly into our EMR. Sponsors are always pushing it, where they want us to download, upload to their box. And that's one thing we've been very, very strong on saying no, because once you start uploading PHI, we don't know where it's going. We don't let any PHI outside of our institution. So, and even things that don't, I don't say don't belong, but things that typically don't go in the EMR, like maybe patient surveys or, I don't know, another example, questionnaire. We actually upload that to our MedStar box where we have control. A sponsor will review it and then we pull it down, but we don't let anything, quote unquote, outside of our facility. But yeah, E-Reg is huge, remote monitoring is huge, but you need to have those processes, policies around it so nothing leaves your institution. I can't stress that enough.
I can understand that. The VA is very particular about what comes in and out, and we have to be very careful.
Yeah, and it's a challenge because sponsors really push, and you know, we push right back.
No, and they've got to understand. We cannot give them that information freely. Are there any other questions from the group? If not, I would like, Mary Ann, thank you so much for doing this. This was extremely helpful for me, and I'm sure for everyone who is listening. And thank you again.
Sure. And if anybody has questions after this, or, you know, they're thinking about implementing anything, you know, please call. I'd be happy to help with anything I can.
And I noticed Rainier has just put the evaluation in the chat. Please make sure you send us in your evaluation and your comments so we can, you know, continue this series and possibly make it bigger and better. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Our next session, let me put in a pitch for the next session, is going to be held on July 28th, and the speaker is Dr. Stephen Hinkson from the FDA, and he's going to talk about remote consenting using the paper process. So we're going to see a little bit of a difference between e-consent and remote consenting and what's allowed. Okay.
Oh, that'll be a good one.
Yeah, it should be. And he's very into decentralized clinical trials. So we're hoping that will work as well. So as I said, please complete your online evaluations. It's located in the chat before you leave. That'd be awesome. But thank you again, Mary Ann. It's great
Thank
to
you,
see everybody.
Priscilla. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.